So welcome everyone to my quilting journey with Amy Pabst. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Alicia Thomas. I'm the executive director of the Virginia Quilt Museum. And could someone confirm in the chat that you can see my nice version of my PowerPoint and Amy and I? That would be great. Thank you, Jill. So we're gonna go ahead and jump in. If you have a question you would like Amy or I to answer during the discussion, please put it in the Q&A box, not in the chat. If you put it in the chat, it's going to get lost and I might not be able to find it. So we're going to hop in. And first, I am going to quickly share some information just about the Virginia Quilt Museum. So for those of you who aren't familiar with us, this is our beautiful location. And we actually moved last year. So some of you may be like, that's not what I remember the Quilt Museum looking like. It's because it's not. So we moved last year about 5 miles from our old location to the Silver Lake Mill. So we're in a historic grain mill that was a grain mill up until 1996, and then it was renovated, and we were very lucky to be able to move into this space. This year is the Virginia Quilt Museum's 30th anniversary. So we opened our doors on August 26, 1995. So we've got a whole bunch of stuff planned for our 30th anniversary later this year, including a really fun exhibition that we're gonna do and a lot of programs in just celebrating our history and that we've been here for 30 years and we hope to be here for another 30. And hopefully we won't move again in those 30 years. Because that was a lot of work. But if you want to come see us, we are open Tuesday through Saturday, 10 a.m. until 4 p.m. Amy's exhibit specifically is on display through Saturday, April 26th. So you've got plenty of time to come see us. I do encourage you to follow both the museum and Amy on social media. So the Quilt Museum, we're on Facebook and Instagram, VA Quilt Museum. We are on YouTube. A recording of this program will be put on our YouTube channel probably in about a week. It may actually be longer. I just realized I'm going on vacation next week, so it might be 2 weeks. And then also our website is where you need to go to register for any programs like this. So that's vaquiltmuseum.org. And then you can find Amy on Instagram at Amy Makes Quilts, where she shares really lovely photos and sometimes videos of her making all of her quilts. So we're gonna go ahead and get started. So Amy's exhibit is called Micro Piecing 250,000. I already said it's on display up through April 26th. And then also, if you are in the area or in the region, you should come see us on Friday, March 21st, because Amy will be here and she'll do a short gallery talk and then just be in her gallery for the whole afternoon. And it's a fun place to spend the afternoon. We are located within a mile of the largest quilt store in Virginia. You can have a whole little quilting afternoon. Come see us, get inspired, and then wander over to Patchwork Plus and buy some great fabric. There's also a really good ice cream place and a coffee shop cafe in Dayton. So like you can have a great time here. And so now we're going to jump into some of the quilts. And so how this is going to go is we're going to talk a little bit about some of Amy's specific quilts, but also about her quilting journey and how she has gotten to where she is today. So this first quilt is one of all of the quilts you'll see are, sorry, I accidentally pressed a button. All the quilts you'll see are in the exhibition, so they're here at the museum on display. And this first one is Stars at Night. It's one of the larger quilts in the exhibit. It's 20 by 32 inches, and each square in the quilt is 2 inches square. And this is one of Amy's original designs. So Amy, before we talk about this quilt specifically, how and when did did you start quilting in general?
Okay, so I learned to sew when I was pretty young, about 10 or 12 years old, and my mom and my grandmother worked at a dry cleaners, and I did all the clothing alterations for the dry cleaners, and I made a good little bit of money for a 12-year-old, but I did not like working on those clothes, replacing zippers and hemming pants. It just wasn't a lot of fun. So, although I was sewing from a pretty early age, I didn't really take up quilting until I was in my 20s. And I was just at the library and I randomly picked up this book about quilting called Simple Contemporary Quilts. And I took off like really fast. Like within just a couple weeks, I had made a couple quilts. So, and I haven't slowed down since, but that's how I got started into quilting.
Wow, that's I don't blame you on alterations. My
Hmm.
mom is a seamstress and has altered clothes my entire life, and it never seems fun.
No, it's not. And the only person I will hem pants for to this day is my dad. I won't hem pants for anyone else.
I think that's totally fair. I once had a swap with one of my friends. She needed like very basic alterations done on a dress, and I did it. And she was like, "How much do I owe you?" And I was like, "I'm not taking your money. We're friends." And she was like, "That doesn't seem fair. I will make you a piece of art." And so she painted me a really cute painting, and I still
Okay.
love it. Um, so, how long roughly have you been quilting, Amy? You said you started in your 20s. Not to, you don't have to give us your exact age.
So I started in 2011. So it's
Okay.
been 14 years now.
Wow. Yeah.
But the quilt that you're showing now, Stars at Night. So it was done. I'm a certified judge, and with the NACQJ, the National Association of Certified Quilt Judges, and they had a challenge that was, oh, it was Our Colors, Your Quilt. So the colors of the organization are blue and yellow. So I was inspired by that color scheme. And as I was working on this, I thought, you know what, this looks like a little bit of some Van Gogh colors. And so that's where the name came from. But so for a quilt like this, I started off with a sketch in EQ8. I have the electric quilt software. So when I'm doing something more complex like this, like some of the designs are just maybe four colors. It's just like the same color scheme in each block repeated over and over. But when I'm doing like a complex design like this, where each block, it's dependent on the blocks around it to determine what color it is, I'll usually do like a sketch in EQ to keep me going.
Yeah. That's,
Yeah,
I just switched our slides to see a little bit different and getting a
yeah,
couple questions of if I can make my slides larger. And the answer is I'm not entirely sure. Um, oh, and now it's just skipping ahead. Um, but this is a detailed shot of that quilt Stars at Night.
yeah.
Um,
So these blocks measure 2 inches square, and there are 101 pieces in each block. So it altogether, I think there was like 13,000 pieces. So this one really added to my piece count.
yeah. I'm gonna stop sharing for just a second and then reshare to see if we can fix the problem. Apparently people are seeing me twice.
Okay.
Brief pause, everyone. Let's see if we can fix this. Okay. How is that showing up now for everyone? Yay, better. Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you for bearing with me. I told Amy this before we started recording, but the one I did with Kevin Womack last week of these discussions, you can't actually see Kevin and I in the recording. You can see all of our very nice slides, but it's just talking voices. Um, so a question that just came in the Q&A
Uh-huh.
is how long, roughly would it take you to make one of the squares in this quilt?
Okay, so I timed myself one time, and each piece to add one individual piece takes about 30 seconds. So if I'm working on a block that has 60 pieces in it, it takes about a half hour. So for this, the yellow and blue quilt that we're working at, the blocks had 101 pieces in them, so about 45 minutes to 50 minutes. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And you didn't lose me, Amy. I just turned off my video because it looks
Okay.
like that was getting in the way of some people. Um, and so this next quilt is Sirens,
Mm-hmm. Yes.
and it's again one of the larger quilts. And from when you started quilting, how did you then get into micro piecing?
Okay, so and I think it was probably 2015 or 16. I really embraced the log cabin block, and I would make 3-inch blocks, foundation piece, and they were not easy to do, but they were definitely doable, and they did really well in competitions. So that was miniature piecing. And after I finished my log cabin series, I was like, now how can I go even smaller? So I went from miniature to piecing to what I call micro piecing. And my personal definition of micro piecing is blocks that are less than 2 inches and individual pieces that are 1/8 inch wide or less.
Oh, wow.
Yes. So
um,
yeah, definitely micro.
yeah, they're amazingly small. Here you can see, I actually want to go back one because also not only are you piecing your blocks, but you pieced this border, correct?
Yeah, yeah. So actually, a lot of my quilts have little piano key borders on them, and actually, they end up great because they make it a lot easier to put on binding because you're have a more controlled edge versus trying to like put your binding directly onto the blocks. And lately, I've been calling when my quilts have the little piano key borders on it, I've been calling it corduroy piecing because especially like in person, it looks almost like the wales on a piece of corduroy.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's also when you're working at this small of a scale, if you were to put a binding on this, you'd be covering at least probably one piece of the block, like one piece in the block.
Well, no, that's the challenges of it. Challenge of it that you have to put the binding on without going into the piecing of the block. So,
Yeah,
um, the piano keyboarders I've been adding to almost all of my quilts lately because it's just so much easier to control the edges when you're putting on binding. Yeah.
that makes so much sense. So this is a quilt that's inspired by another quilt. How does your technique and your process differ when you're working off something you're inspired by as opposed to your own original design?
Mhm. So when I'm working from someone else's design, usually I don't take their design and recreate it just based on their design. I usually try to like modify it and sort of make it my own. But when I do work with the designs of others, the first thing to do is contact that person and make sure they're okay with me making a quilt inspired by their piece.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and when it's different. Like when I'm doing my own original designs, I get kind of like gripped almost, like gripped with a fever to work on them. Whereas like when I'm working with someone else's designs, I'm still like just as excited about it, but it doesn't take as much like mental space because I'm not designing the whole quilt myself.
That makes sense. I always say with writing, the worst thing is starting with a blank page. And so
Yeah,
I imagine that's the same with your original designs. Like you have to come up with everything.
right. Yeah. And a
Um,
lot of the times when I'm working with an original design, I won't have the entire finished piece in mind. I'll just kind of make several blocks and then see how they fit together. So sometimes from the beginning of a quilt, I'll have like a really specific plan, but other times I just kind of go along and see what I end up with, see what the blocks are saying when I go to lay them out.
that makes sense. And this, we skipped ahead a little bit in my slides, but I think that's okay because this is another one of your original designs.
Mhm,
So do you
yeah.
remember when you made this one, did you have a plan? Had you designed it in EQ8 or was this one where you were just making blocks and playing with it?
So this quilt, the fabrics from it came from Pro Chemical and Dye in Massachusetts. It was a hand dyed bundle of just lovely pastel colors. And so I kind of planned that it was like a scale of 15 different shades of fabric. And I kind of planned a little bit that I was only going to work with fabrics that were right next to each other in the scale. So, like, I'd be putting green and yellow together and not green and red, or putting like blue and red together and not blue and um, yellow. So for this one, I made all my blocks and then I took a picture of it in grayscale to see like what the lightest values were, and then I just started laying them out in sort of like a diagonal pattern. So yeah, this was one where once I had made the blocks, I came up with the finished design.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
It's amazing. It's maybe my favorite in the exhibit. I really love the colors of it. I love
Mm-hmm.
pink, so this one appeals to me and my love of pink. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but when you're doing your own design, you said this one was all based on one line of fabrics, but where
Mm-hmm.
else are you drawing your inspiration from?
For my own designs, I look at a lot of antique quilts and I look at a lot of contemporary quilts. And when I'm coming up with my own designs, I think all of those quilts are there in the back of my mind all along as inspiration. And usually the designs will come out one way or the other, um, just like based on the fabrics I'm using and the impact I'm trying to make. Yeah.
And then what originally drew you to the pineapple block?
Okay. So, like I mentioned, I started with the log cabin block.
Mm-hmm.
And the pineapple is a variation of the log cabin block.
Yeah,
And what works great about the pineapple, or I'm sorry, the reason why I've kind of embraced it is because you get the whole entire block on a single piece of foundation. So, like, as opposed to like if I were making miniature sawtooth stars, those are put together in three sections of foundation. And so you have a lot of bulk where the seams would be joined together. So because the pineapple block is all just one single piece of foundation, there's a lot less bulk. And the only bulk comes from when you actually sew the blocks together.
that makes sense.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And the log cabin block is the same way in that it's just all on one single foundation and not in different sections on the same foundation.
We have a lot of questions coming in, and we're going to answer those all at the end. So, everyone, I am seeing all of your questions. We're just going to tackle them all at one time once we get through the slides.
Yeah.
Especially this keeps jumping ahead on me. Maybe I should not try to do these on Friday afternoons. But this is your smallest quilt.
Mhm.
in the
Yes.
exhibit and the one with the smallest blocks. And I got
Yes.
to tell you, photographing this thing was hard. Um, so the entire quilt is 10 inches by 10 inches, and each block is half an inch square.
Yes. Yeah.
Um,
And then each block has, I think, 7 times 4, 20, 28 or 29 pieces in it. So I don't think it was, I love a challenge. So I wanted to see just how small I could go. And I don't think it's like physically possible to go any smaller than this because I really struggled getting the accuracy on this one because if you're piecing on a foundation and you're trying to stitch right along the printed line, um, when it's this small, if you're even just like slightly to the left or right of the line, it really affects the overall accuracy of the block. And another thing about working this small is that you can't use traditional fabrics because they're just too thick. Like they would just distort the block. So the fabrics for this little red and white quilt are just like synthetic lining fabrics that are really super lightweight and that like I said if you tried to use like a thicker cotton you wouldn't be able to piece the block really. So yeah, the smaller you go, the you have to pay more attention to like the type of thread that you're using because the thread adds bulk and the type of fabrics that you're using also.
that makes so much sense, but is not something I had thought of. Um, here's like I could tell when I was photographing this one and getting close to it, I was like, that's not cotton, but I can't, I'm not good enough at just identifying fabric.
Yeah, it's just
That I,
oh sorry, go ahead.
no, I was just like, I'm not sure what it is, but here just, close ups of these teeny tiny blocks.
Yeah, it was just polyester synthetic lining hmm for like clothing.
Um, and this one, were you at all inspired by the tradition of red and white quilts with this one, or was it just,
Yes, yes. So when I envisioned this quilt, I knew that I wanted to do something simple in just two colors, to kind of keep the emphasis on and all the focus on the piecing and the scale of the piecing and not necessarily on the design so much. And
mm-hmm.
I was definitely inspired for so many of my quilts by the Infinite Variety display that was on in New York City in I think 2014 or 15. It's been a while, but
Yeah,
that that red and white that really like lodged the red and white tradition in my mind. So yeah, that's how I came up with this color scheme for this particular piece.
that makes sense. And it really does emphasize just how small the squares and the piecing are, because
Mhm.
like if you'd done all the colors that you did in Soft Pride this small, I don't think it had the same effect. It'd get a little lost in.
No, so that's why like that red and white, there's such a high value contrast in it that it just like I said, it puts the emphasis on the piecing rather than on the design so much.
Um, are you still doing micro piecing quilts, or are you
Yes.
kind of done?
No, I don't think I'll ever stop with the log cabins and the pineapples. There's always a new one in my mind. And the piece that I'm working on now is pink and yellow. And I've never worked with pink and yellow together in a quilt before. And it's 2-inch blocks, and there's, I think, 112 pieces in each block. And the individual pieces are just a few millimeters wide. They're really narrow pieces and I'm really enjoying working on that. I'm hoping that it will be my competition piece for 2026. So I hope to keep working on it and finish it up this summer. So yeah, I'm still doing the micro piecing.
Nice. So I think while we answer a bunch of questions, I'm going to stop sharing and turn my video back on so that I can just ask you questions and we can chat a little bit.
Yeah.
Um, so I'm just going to start at the top of our questions. So the first one is, you have any suggestions about where someone could find micro patterns, if there are any?
Okay.
Uh,
Um, I don't know of anyone off the top of my head. I know George Siciliano sells a lot, has a lot of patterns, and he actually has kits for his patterns too, where he picks out the fabrics for you. Um, I I get all of my like the actual foundation design that I print onto the foundations. I get that off of EQ8. So if you're looking for like they have a whole library of blocks on there. I think there's 50 different variations of the pineapple block. So that's like the best way to get the actual foundations printed. And the EQ8 is pretty simple to learn. So,
mhm,
and you can take the foundations that are in the built into the database, or you can draw your own foundations, and you can print them to any size that you want, down to a half inch up to 6 or 8 inches.
that's great. Yeah, EQ8 is really fun to play with.
Mm, yeah.
um, I should also say that they were very generous to us as a museum and gave us like a very nice rate and are fine with us having it on a public computer for our visitors to play with.
Oh,
So
wonderful. Wow.
EQ8.
Yeah.
Um, there's a couple of questions about if you do trunk shows or lectures directly to guilds. There's a lot of people who are interested in having you come virtually or in person to their guilds.
Yeah, I absolutely love to do trunk shows and programs, and um, I have a pretty popular workshop that's like miniature piecing and micro piecing, and I'm a full-time student right now, so my schedule is a little booked up. But I do have some openings for this summer, and then I graduate in December of this year, so in 2026 I'm pretty wide open.
That's good. And what's the best way for people to contact you if they want to book you for
Okay,
something?
that would be by email, and it is amypabs19@gmail.com. So amypabs19@gmail.com.
Yeah, and we'll put that in the chat so everybody has it. Um, and someone asked, what are you studying? If you
Okay,
want to
so
tell us.
I'm working on a fine arts degree in uh, fibers. So my classes are like surface design and weaving and textile construction. And then I also have minors in creative writing and women's studies. So a lot of my education, I'm thinking about just like the bigger context of women making quilts for years and years and years. So, but yeah, it's a fine arts degree in fibers. So
Nice,
I'm enjoying it a lot.
that's great. Um, so a couple of questions about um, your machine. So if you
Mhm.
could, someone asked if you hand sew any of your blocks, but I don't believe you do. You're
No.
doing everything on
Um,
machine.
yeah. The only part of my process that I do by hand is the binding process. But so I do all of my piecing on a 1947 Singer featherweight, and it's just a great little machine that just the straight stitch is all you need. And for my piecing, this is something I didn't get a chance to talk about, but for my piecing, I use monofilament thread that's like 100 weight, and I use that because it doesn't add any bulk. Because if you use like a regular weight cotton thread, it adds a significant amount of bulk for each piece that you add, for each seam that's in the piece. So the monofilament thread, it works great in the Singer featherweight. Like I know that like some people have like problems like adjusting the tension and just
Mhm.
struggle a little bit with the monofilament thread, but the featherweight just takes it like a dream. So that's why it's my like preferred machine of choice for the piecing. And then for the quilting, I use a Bernina machine, and then I do the binding by hand.
Okay. Yeah. And you answered someone else's question about what thread size do you use? Um, so that's good.
Yeah, and the specific thread that I use the most is Monopoly by Superior Threads. There's other brands like Sulky has a pretty good monofilament thread, but monopoly is it's easy to get at any quilt shop, and so yeah, and it's really lightweight and it doesn't add any bulk at all to the seams. And I also use it for my quilting. So I stitch in the ditch on around each, not around each block, but actually through each block, and the monofilament thread works great for that because it does. I don't want my thread to show when I'm quilting because I think that like for the micro piecing, you want all the emphasis to be on the piecing and not the quilting. So using that monofilament thread hides the quilting too.
Yeah. And in kind of that same vein about your tools, someone asked, what size needle are you using?
Yeah, so I use the smallest size needle that I can get to cooperate with my machine and with the thread. So I think for the featherweight, I use a size 11 needle, and really you just got to use whatever needle, like the needle size isn't as important as you would think. So I use, like I said, it's an 11 when I'm piecing, and then for my quilting, since I'm quilting with the monofilament thread, I use Superior's top stitch needle. I think size 7010. Yeah.
And someone asked, how are you cutting your fabric strip?
Okay. So I start off the strips that I start with. I cut at 3/4 of an inch. And with this foundation piecing, there's so much that gets trimmed, so much fabric that gets trimmed off and thrown away. So you waste a lot of fabric, and you want to start with just the narrowest strip that you can. And when I first started, micro piecing, I started with like 1 inch strips, but then like as I got a little bit better and better with handling the fabrics, I was able to use even less fabric and cut them at 3/4 of an inch. And I think if you cut any smaller than that, the pieces just kind of frizzle up and you can't use them. So if you're starting micro piecing, start with 1 inch, and then as you get better, try and keep decreasing the size of your strips.
That makes sense. Yeah, because at some point it is just going to start unraveling on you.
Right, right. Especially with like, I use a lot of specialty fabrics like silks and synthetics, and they do fray pretty badly. Yeah. And so, like, when working with those specialty fabrics, I only cut my strips as I need them. I don't cut a whole bunch and let them sit around because they just fray like crazy. So I just kind of cut them on demand.
That makes sense. And I know we've got a couple questions about what kind of fabrics you use. So you're working with a little bit of everything. I know you've got a couple that were made out of men's ties, I believe.
Yeah, yeah. So, this technique, foundation piecing, after you piece your block, you leave the foundation in, you don't pull it out. So it adds like a layer of stability to your whole quilt. And because of that, you can use any type of fabric that you want. I have quilts that have like spandex in them, like spandex fabrics. And I worked with like synthetic linings from vintage kimono jackets. I work a lot with that type of fabric. And then I love to work with silk and silk blends. Like silk dupioni is my favorite because just of like the beautiful luminosity of the fabric. So yeah, you can use any sort of fabric that you want because of that extra stabilizing layer.
That's fascinating. That I don't know if you're at all familiar with the work of Sandy Curran. She's a Virginia quilter who primarily does portrait quilts, but she
Okay.
works a lot in silk dupioni. And now I'm like, I need the two of you to collaborate on something because it would be
Hmm.
amazing.
Yeah, it's the loveliest fabric. It's so nice.
Yeah, and she does really beautiful, like they're all applique that she's doing to create these portraits, and
Oh, cool.
they're stunning. Um, she's fantastic. We had a display of her stuff last year, and it was just really lovely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
A couple of people have asked questions about your seams? Are you doing like a normal 1/4 inch seam allowance or smaller? And how do you deal with the bulk of the seams?
Mhm. So, I usually trim my seam allowances like as with foundation piecing, you trim as you go along. So I usually trim them to a little bit less than 1/8 of an inch, and my stitch length is a little bit smaller. So that way I make sure that all of my seam allowances are held in place. Um, but so each like these little quilts are really, really stiff. And even like the 2 inch blocks and the 1 inch blocks and the 1/2 inch blocks, they're really stiff because there's just like so many layers of fabric in there. So it can be kind of challenging when you're sewing the blocks together because the edges of the block are really bulky also. So you try to just like you can't really control all that bulk, so you just because it's just like a part of the foundation piecing. So you try to minimize it and then just figure out like strategies on how to like handle the blocks because they're bulkier.
That makes sense. Looking through, someone's asking if you've ever worked with batiks, and kind of wondering if they have a similar weight to the polyester fabric lining. I think batiks would still be thicker than a polyester lining.
Yeah, so yeah, a batik would act about the same way as a quilter's cotton was as far as bulk goes. Um, really you really just need to get into the thinner fabrics like this the smaller you go with like the 1/2 inch or 1 inch block, but with a 2 inch block you could get away with using a batik, and I do use batiks in my quilts. And actually my favorite use of batiks is to use them as binding because they have that extra, I don't know, they've got like a stiffer hand to it and they hold a crease really, really well. So you can really get some nice sharp looking binding with batik. So it's pretty much what I use exclusively for my bindings.
Okay, that makes sense. Um, and then a question I had is, what does your stash look like? Because since you are working with so many different fabrics, and are you buying like a lot of fabric, or are you buying like fat quarter sizes, things like that, or
Mhm.
just everything?
Yeah. So a lot of my quilts are also very scrappy. And so usually when I buy fabrics, I get 1/8 yard cuts or 1/4 yard cuts. And I think quilt shop employees kind of groan when they see me coming because I have a huge stack of fabric or a stack of bolts, and I only end up getting like an 1/8 or a 1/4 yard. Um, a lot of times, like with the silks, and other specialty fabrics like that, there I'll be ordering from somewhere where there's like a 1 yard minimum or 2 yard minimum. So I do have like several pieces of like larger silk fabrics in my stash, and they like one piece of fabric will end up in like 2 or 3 different quilts. So yeah, my stash is just kind of all over the place. And then I also have a basket that's just full of leftover strips, and there's so much fabric in that basket. Yeah.
Yeah. How do you organize your stash? Are you organizing it by color or by fabric or both?
Um,
Or
I organize it by fabric type, I think. Like all my solids go together and all my specialty fabrics go together. All my synthetics go in one place, and then like my quilter's cottons is split up a little bit by color, but mostly it's like by fabric type and fiber content.
that makes sense. Someone asked if you've ever had trouble ironing using the monofilament.
Yeah, so on all of my micro piecing quilts, because of the the foundation and the thread and the specialty fabrics that I'm using, I only ever use a medium heat iron. The monofilament thread is polyester and it can take probably a higher heat, but I always just do a medium heat iron just to be safe and protect all the fabrics and make sure I'm not scorching anything.
Yeah, the last thing you'd want to do is get, blocks completed or a quilt completed and then ruin it with your iron.
Yeah, yeah. And the only time actually that I use an iron in my process is when I'm sewing the blocks together. I'll press the seams open, but during the actual construction of the block, it's all finger pressing. And then of course I press with the binding too. But yeah, I always just use a medium heat iron.
And a couple of people are asking for clarification. So you're using fabric as your foundation, not paper, or are you
Oh,
using both?
so yeah, that's a good question. I use for my foundations a product called Foundation Stuff by George Siciliano. It's a product that he designed specifically to go in his miniature quilts. So it comes in 8.5 by 11 sheets that you can run through your printer, and it feels kind of like a really, like to the touch, it feels like a really bulked up sheet, like dryer sheet. So
Okay.
it's comparable to like some like the embroidery stabilizers that you see, but it's
Hmm.
just a really thin, flexible foundation. And yes, it does get left in the quilt. And like I said, you can run it through your printer. So that's how I get my designs from EQ7 onto the foundations.
That makes sense. And then another question, are you using any batting or are you just, I know a lot of times log cabins, people don't use any batting.
Mhm. Yeah. So for all of my little micro piecing quilts, I use just a lightweight flannel for batting. And I've started also using flannel for like my bigger log cabin competition pieces, just because there's so much quilting that it just mashes whatever you use for batting. And the flannel seems to work really well to just give the quilt an overall really nice shape. Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. Just scrolling through. What competitions are you entering? You've mentioned, and I know you had a piece at Road to California
Mhm.
recently, correct?
Yeah. So typically when I finish a quilt, its first stop is Road to California, and then it goes through the AQS circuit, and then it goes to the Houston show. So you kind of have to plan in advance, because some of these shows you have to enter like you have to ship your quilt there like 4 or 5 months before the show. Like the
Hmm.
Houston show, I think you have to ship in August. So you have to really like plan ahead by at least a year, so you have time to make the quilt, get it photographed, get it shipped off. Um, so yeah, I pay attention to the competition calendars for sure.
Yeah. Do you remember what the first competition you entered was, or when you won your first prize?
Yeah, yeah. So my very first prize was the first quilt show I ever entered. It was the Mountain State Arts and Crafts Fair in Ripley, West Virginia, and I had made and this was about 6 months after I had started quilting, and I had made a sampler quilt for my mom and dad for their anniversary, and it was queen size, and it was like light green and really like bright, shocking pink, and it had embroidery in the corner that said happy anniversary. And I entered that quilt in the show, and I didn't know what to expect or anything like that, and I got an honorable mention ribbon, and that ribbon is still hanging on my bedroom wall. And it just like I caught like a fever for it for competition. So yeah, that was the first show that I had entered.
That's great. So in the chat, Stephanie mentioned your book, and folks are wondering where they can buy your book.
Yeah, so sadly, Quilt Mania closed this year, or well, last year, I should say.
Yeah.
And so I don't have access to the book, any of the copies of the book anymore.
Oh,
There are still a few like quilt shop websites online that have it in stock, but it's kind of hard to find. So that's a big disappointment.
yeah, we're losing our quilt publishers,
Yeah,
unfortunately, and
it's
it's
it's, it's bad.
it's hard for the industry. I keep hoping someone will step up and fill some of the gaps we're having, but
Hmm.
I don't know the answer to that. We the museum has the same problem. We published a book in the early 2000s, and that publisher is now gone out of print. So like we've got like our 5 copies we've hoarded.
Yeah.
And people are like, "Can I have that?" And I'm like, "No, no, you cannot." Um,
I see
So
Stephanie says she has a copy and she might let it go for $1 million. All right.
hey, you got to make your money however you can, Steph.
Yeah.
Someone asked if you're on YouTube or if you have video tutorials any place where they
Mhm.
can see them.
I do not currently have any tutorials. There are quite a few videos on YouTube where you can like see sort of my process. My full process, I do have a quilt show episode with the quilt show with Alex Anderson. And
Hmm.
on that episode, I do actually demo like the sewing, the actual fabric going under the needle. So you can see that there, but I don't have any like full tutorials that I've put out on my own.
Yeah, it's a lot of work to put stuff like
Mhm.
that together, and you've been a little busy.
Yeah.
um, do you have any public workshops scheduled where if people just want to drop into a workshop with you, they can, or is everything you've got scheduled kind of with guilds and things?
Yeah, they're all like with guilds. I'm looking to work with a group in York, Pennsylvania, and oh gosh, I can't remember the rest of my calendar. But if there's a guild out there that's interested in having me, then I'm definitely available next year or this summer. So
Yeah. And what do you have plans for next year? I assume you're going to keep quilting and keep entering competitions and teaching, but do you have
mhm.
other big plans you're ready to talk about yet? Or
um, I at some point I would like to try to go to grad school, but I think I'll probably take about a year and a half off after undergrad to kind of like because being at school full time, I've had to like neglect a lot of my quilting contacts, and like I haven't been
Mhm.
able to make it to as many shows and seminars. And so, yeah, I hope to spend about a year and a half catching up with the quilting world before I apply for grad school.
Yeah. What other quilt organizations are you involved in or want to be involved in when you have
Hmm.
maybe a little bit more free time?
Hmm. I'd really like to get involved with SAQA. I think they do so much for the quilting community and their members, and I'd really like to start exhibiting with them and being a part of their traveling exhibits. And I'm also a member of the American Quilt Study Group, and that's something that's kind of like been on the back burner while I've been in school. But I would like to get a lot more involved with that organization also.
Yeah, SACWA and AQSG are both great groups. If
Hmm.
you guys are not members of them, they're both doing really different things. So SACWA, the Studio Art Quilt Associates, are really focused on art quilters. They put together exhibitions on a lot of levels. So they do global exhibitions and then they also do regional ones. And they're all fabulous. HUSG is the American Quilt Study Group. It's where I met Amy in person for the first time. We'd actually already accepted this exhibit, and I was like, "Oh my God, I know you." Um, but they're kind of the research side of the quilt world. Jill in the chat is saying AQSG misses you, Amy. We
Yeah.
we missed you last year. I was like, "Where's he?" Um,
Yeah.
but they're both fantastic organizations that you guys should check out. SACWA's conference is coming up in April, and I know that because I'm actually presenting at it this year, talking about working with museums. So if you're going to be in St. Petersburg at the beginning of April, you should come to that conference. Um, but does anyone have any other questions? We've got time for a few more. Is there anything else you wanted to talk about, Amy?
I really appreciate everybody showing up and asking questions and watching the episode. I am delighted to talk about quilts any day, all day.
Uh, One of the questions that I forgot to ask is
Mhm.
how um, are you working on one piece at a time, or do you have like multiple projects going?
Usually I have like one, especially since I've gone back to school, I have like one competition piece that I'm really super focused on. But then I try to make quilts for my classes as much as possible. So I usually have a couple like academic quilts for my classes going on. And then I have a couple that are just like kind of like fun, low stress. Let's just see how it turns out. But usually it's one major competition piece at a time.
Um, we just got a question in the chat of when you submit an exhibit to a show or a museum, are you compensated? And I can talk a little bit about that from the museum side. At least specifically our museum, we don't compensate for exhibits, but we do help cover shipping.
Hmm.
Um, and then any classes we pay for and things like that. But how does it work with shows? I don't know the answer to that.
Hmm. Yeah, usually the shows and museums that I'm work with, they'll help with shipping. And then like your museum is when I come for the Meet the Artist Day, you're going to help with a little bit of travel expenses. So,
Yeah.
but mostly it's just like my goal with exhibiting at shows and museums is to put my work out there. And I'm not super focused on the financial aspect of that. I just really want to get my work out there.
Yeah. And we wish we could pay everyone gobs of money to show their quilts, but we just don't have the budget.
Yeah, and it's what the quilt museums do for the quilting world is incredible. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Um, someone asked once again if you could say which shows and festivals your quilt is going to be at this year.
Okay, so so far this year, my quilt was at Road to California, and then it will be at AQS Daytona Beach and AQS Branson and AQS Paducah. And I'm hoping that it will also get into the Grand Rapids and Lancaster AQS shows. And then I hope to also have a quilt at the Houston show this year.
Nice. Yeah. And a couple other questions. Um, do you think it would work to kind of do the opposite of micro piecing, but go really big?
Um, I occasionally make big quilts. I'm working on a piece right now that oh, it's probably 60 inches by 60 inches, and the pieces are maybe 2 by 4 inches. So that's really kind of like, and it's foundation piece, so it's like a similar process, but those are like giant pieces to me. And it's
Yeah.
actually a lot more challenging for me to foundation piece a large block because there's like so much that can go wrong with like the fabric shifting or sliding or getting folded under. Whereas like when you're working with a micro piece block, you've practically got your thumb will hold down the entire piece, so you've got a little bit more control over what happens to the fabric because it's smaller and you can hold on to it. So I'm challenged by regular size foundation piecing for sure.
That makes sense. You've gotten so used to working at the small level that you're like, I don't know what to do with these big things anymore.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then one other question is once you finish your degree, do you think you'll start making more, um, maybe more art quilts, a little more in the art quilt world as opposed to kind of the traditional world?
Yeah, I think so. A lot of the quilts that I've made, like specifically for my classes, but also in the past couple years, have been more focused on surface design. Like I took a class in indigo dyeing, so I've made probably 4 quilts now that are regular size or wall size quilts, not micro piecing, but are dyed with indigo. So yeah, I'm slowly getting into more of the art quilting, and like I said, there's definitely I have more of a focus on surface design because I'm just getting more experience with that all the time. So
And then another question, do you ever sell your quilts? And this is actually something people have asked us. They're like, are these for sale? And I'm like, I don't think so.
yeah, so With my competition pieces and then my big series, the log cabin series and my micro piecing series, they're not for sale right now because I feel like they have a lot of traveling left to do. But the goal is like the ultimate goal for me is to be able to support myself through selling art. So at some point they definitely will be up for sale.
Well, you will have to keep us informed because people will be interested in that.
Yeah, that's what I'm
Um,
hoping.
and then, but I agree, they should keep traveling for a while. It's a
Mhm.
really fantastic exhibit. Um, I know on social media, I shared a short reel of it right when it opened, and it's been like our most popular social media post ever. It's great. Um, and then I think we'll wrap up with one last question, which is what do you consider the hardest or most difficult part of the process of making your quilt?
Oh, okay. So the hardest part is when you've got all your blocks made and you're trying to sew them together when you've got 20 rows and 20 columns. So, yeah, that's probably the trickiest part because when you're working with the edges of the blocks, there's almost like a sculptural quality to them where you can like bend them and get them to shift when you're sewing them together. So, it's probably sewing together the blocks and then sometimes the quilting can get pretty difficult, especially like I'm thinking about the log cabin quilt I just did. Um, it was 50 by 60 inches, and for I'm stitching in the ditch, and it's a log cabin, so it's kind of like a big boxy spiral. And so you have to stitch one seam and then turn the quilt, and then stitch a ditch and then turn the quilt, and then stitch a ditch and then turn the quilt. So the bigger the quilt gets, like the more wrestling that you have to do with it. So yeah, I'd say that's the hardest part is actually getting the blocks together and then getting it quilted. But the actual piecing for me is so much fun. And it's to the point where I've done so many that it's not really difficult anymore. I can like tune out and let my mind wander and listen to an audiobook and just like really, really have a good time with the piecing. So the piecing is my favorite part for sure.
Oh, that's great. And then one last question. There's always going to be one last question, but someone asked if you ever use a treadle machine or are you just using your featherweight?
I would love to use a treadle machine. I have a few and they're in pretty rough shape. But that is a goal of mine because I think that I don't know, it's kind of fun to say, oh, I do all this piecing on a Singer featherweight, but I think it would be even more fun to be like, oh, I do this on a treadle machine. But so yeah, that's a goal for sure.
Yeah, we need to get Mia from AQS out to you because she works on treadles, so she
Hmm.
can come visit you and fix your treadle for you.
Yeah, yeah.
um, Also, I feel like treadles and hand cranks, they're so easy to control the stitches that it would maybe actually be really great for this type of work where like,
Hmm. Hmm.
because I sometimes modern machines, they stitch so fast. I'm like, I don't know how you could do this on a
Right.
modern
Yeah.
machine. Um, Someone asked, what what is the stitch count on your featherweight?
Okay, I don't know the exact number, but you want your stitches to be about 2 millimeters. So they don't need to be like tiny, tiny little seed stitches because you're not trying to perforate the foundation so that you can tear it out, but you don't want big giant stitches either. So you want something that's small enough that it will like make sure that your seam allowances are secure. So about 2 millimeters is a good stitch length. Yeah.
2 millimeters, nothing big, guys. Well, that looks like everybody's questions, and it is 4:29, so we took up almost a full hour. We had a
Ah, great,
little
great.
technical glitches in there, but I think everybody had a great time. Thank you so much, Amy. Thank you to everyone for joining us. Her exhibit's up through April 26th. And if you come on that last day, April 26th, it is also going to be a fiber festival that we're doing with our neighbors over at Fort Harrison. And it's also the Red Bud Festival here in our town. So there's going to be tons going on April 26th, but it'll be a really fun day. But also, if at all possible, come on Friday, March 21st, so you can meet Amy in person. If you can find a copy of her book, bring it, and I'm sure she will sign it for you.
Definitely.
And come and have a great day in our little section of Virginia. And thank you, Amy. Thank you for letting us have your work. We're so excited. People are loving it. And we will see you guys all later.
Yes, thank you, Alicia. And thanks to everybody for tuning in.
Yeah.